All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lori Voline. I am the Program Director for the Homeland Security and Emergency Management degree programs here at Idaho State University. We're very glad that you're here. We'd like to welcome you to our Leadership Insights webinar series. On behalf of ISU and our guest speaker, thank you for joining us today. Idaho State University's Institute of Emergency Management and the Emergency Services Department are proud to host these webinars. They are the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Leadership Insights series, in which we bring together leaders and influencers in emergency management and homeland security to share their knowledge and perspectives with the ISU community and beyond. And so before we get started, today we have with us Calvin Terada, and I will give you a more thorough introduction to Calvin here shortly. But a few housekeeping items. All participants are currently going to come in muted, and the questions will be held until we touch base with you. And if we see that you've got questions that are rolling in, we'll make sure to check in and get those throughout the webinar. So we encourage you to please create some questions for our speakers that we can address during today's conversation. As we go through, we'll try to work in as many of those questions as we can. And just a heads up that some upcoming webinars that we will have David Reedman, and he is the initiator of the K-12 school shooting database, and he does an awful lot of research in those categories. So he will be speaking with us next week. And then following right after that, we will have Kara Gronberg works for the National Football League. She works for the NFL, and she did the intelligence analyzing prior to the Super Bowl. So she has some kind of special events insights that she will be sharing with us. So you'll see that we've got also in the month of April, later in the month, we'll have Sasha Larkin. She is with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, which is coincidentally where the Super Bowl was this year, and also can speak to the mass shootings that they had, unfortunately, in that particular area coming forward. So at this point in time, I would like to, officially get us started. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker. This is Calvin Terada with the Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. Terada is the director of EPA's Region 10 Superfund and Emergency Management Division. He oversees more than 300 long-term hazardous waste Superfund cleanup activities, time-critical hazardous waste cleanups, site assessments, and emergency prevention, planning, and preparedness and response activities along the states in Region 10, which includes Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. He previously served as the acting branch chief for the Remedial cleanup program and as the federal on-scene coordinator and emergency response section chief, and eventually the emergency management branch chief. Under Calvin's leadership, the EPA Region 10 Emergency Response Program became nationally recognized for its rapid, effective, and well-coordinated event management for incidents occurring in Region 10. Calvin also spent 8 years in the Office of Water, working on grants management as a tribal specialist, drinking and groundwater protection programs, and the underground injection control program. Lots of different things you have racked up on your resume there, Calvin. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Lori, absolutely fantastic to be here. And again, thank you very much to Idaho State University and all of the folks that are tuning in from all over the place is what I understand. This is absolutely fantastic.
Okay,
So,
great. I think that I know you have some slides and some information that you'd like to use to get us kicked off. So please go ahead and share your slides and
okay.
the floor is open to you.
All right, fasten your seatbelts, everybody. We have just a few slides that talk a little bit about what EPA does, and I'll bring this up, and then we'll then open up for all of the questions that you may have relating to what we do and how we do it. Again, Lori, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction and the long, boring resume. It just means that I've been working for the Environmental Protection Agency here for a long time. Really, this is my 30th year, if you can believe it. I started off as an intern straight out of the University of Washington with a background in environmental health, and then obviously spent a lot of time in the water program. But most of my time I've been in the Superfund and Emergency Management Division, as you can see. I wanted to just walk through about six bullets here, 6 slides on what we do to give you a little bit of background about what EPA does, how we do it, how the national program is all broken out, and then talk about our program here in Region 10. And again, we covered the states of Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. I thought I'd walk you through some of the things that what I call is keep me up at night, threats that we may encounter from the standpoint of EPA, and then maybe some of the tools that we use that you're probably all familiar with and or learning as part of your schooling. And then we'll just turn it back over to you all because one of the things that I really enjoy the most is just being able to answer questions and talk about my experience. And so without further ado, we'll just kind of walk through our national program. So EPA is an independent agency. We talk about Homeland Security, and there is a department, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, which is a broader agency, which has many other sub-agencies in it. For example, the Secret Service, the Coast Guard, they're all within the Department of Homeland Security. But EPA is an independent agency, very similar to NASA and the Veterans Administration. And we're broken up into 10 ways with 10 regions, obviously, and you can kind of see the color coding there on the slide deck. But the thing that brings Region 10 that's quite unique is the size of our region. We have the largest geographic area to cover, and generally the smallest of all of the national programs. We have the smallest number of staff to be able to do it. Roughly within EPA Region 10, we have about 650, maybe close to 700 managers and staff that implement the various environmental and public health programs. But as you can see in the overlay there, we have the great state of Alaska, which is huge, and be able to look at, for example, oil or other hazardous material spills up in Alaska. You know, you can't drive a lot of places there, so you have to fly. And so it really does make for a unique challenge when you work at EPA Region 10. This next slide just describes the makeup of our division. We have about 125, 130 folks with broken up into essentially 3 branches. One branch is our emergency management and assessment branch. We have an operations and an enforcement branch. One of the things that is unique to the laws that the Superfund program implements is to be able to make sure the polluters pay. Whether you spill oil or spill hazardous substances, you know, those people that are responsible end up having to pay. And in the event that they don't or they can't, then that's where the federal taxpayer, the federal government, is able to then come in to be able to make sure that the spill is cleaned up. And then we continue to figure out if there are other responsible parties. We utilize our enforcement mechanisms to make sure that polluters are held responsible for any spill or any other mess that they create. The other branch that we have and is the biggest branch is our long-term cleanup sites, what we all call Superfund sites, and there are quite a few in Idaho, but within the Region 10 area, all 4 of our states, we have roughly about 300 of these long-term sites. So that's how we're kind of broken up in our division. The next slide just kind of walks you through the sub programs within the emergency management branch. Um, we have our emergency response program, and those are the folks. We have responders, and what they do are very similar to the fire department or other emergency responders. They have, they in order to be able to respond, they practice, they plan, they prepare. There's equipment involved. So all of those functions are within our emergency response program. We have an emergency prevention program, very similar to a lot of inspections to prevent either oil spills or hazardous materials from being released. So also being able to know what's in your backyard, the types of chemicals or other flammable materials. Those types of programs are in our program, and those are unique from the standpoint that there are performance requirements that need to be met in order to be able to make sure that they are safeguarding the public, so that chemicals do not really get released into the environment or into where people could get exposed. And so inspections happen very similar to gas stations or any other kinds of places where it may be a bit hazardous. And so our inspectors go in, and if they find violations, we make sure that there's corrective actions in place. One of the things that is unique to our program, at least in the emergency management side, we have the ability to go out and do time critical cleanups. These are short-term actions. It could be a mitigating action. It could be emergency response, but we do have the funding and the authority and the contracts to be able to move quickly, to be able to ensure that folks are taken out of harm's way. And so we often, our responders are out looking for sites or end up responding to sites and making sure that they're cleaned up. And in the event that they become too big to be able to handle, that's where then the long-term sites cleanup programs start to come into play. And then finally, we have our site assessment program. And that's really at the beginning of the Superfund process. They are reviewing all different types of sites that are referred to us, but in some cases, some of these sites are so massive or so complex, they really deserve consideration to our Superfund national priorities list, otherwise known as the Superfund program. And that's where some of these larger sites are designated for federal action or being overseen by EPA to be able to make sure that those that are held responsible for the cleanup action, that we go ahead and do so. The next few slides just kind of talks about some of the work that we do. And as I said, in our emergency response program, our bread and butter work really is responding to oil and hazmat incidents. We are the federal backstop in the inland zone. And so the way that the federal government is broken up is that if you're in marine waters, it's the U.S. Coast Guard. They have a marine pollution response program. And so the Coast Guard responds, working with the state, is working with others to be able to make sure that our coastal waters are protected. And then in the inland area, it's EPA. And we work hand in hand with the Coast Guard in these areas where we have, upland sources end up potentially contaminated or having an effect into marine waters. We work together very, very well, as well as the state and others. But in the inland areas it's all of EPA, and we work directly with the states and the tribes as well as local emergency responders. In the picture that you see, where it says Safeco Field is now T-Mobile Park, and I just reminded that it is actually the first day of Major League Baseball. I think the first game for at least the Seattle Mariners is taking place today or tonight. And so you can see that one of the places that is common to be able to train. I think some of your future speakers will be talking about that, whether it's the NFL or Major League Baseball or other places. Gathering centers for a lot of people end up being unfortunate targets of people that want to create harm to innocent people. And so it is often that EPA, as well as many of the other law enforcement agencies and fire departments, will go into a large public area and conduct training operations to be able to make sure that we can respond effectively. The other pictures that you see tanks that are burning. Those are actually rail cars that were full of crude oil. That's actually in Mosier, Oregon. I think Lori has a little bit of history of that too. As we were talking before the session, there was a large crude oil train derailment there that took place almost 10 years ago. In right in the town of Mosier along the Columbia River. It was a crude oil train with essentially 100 cars, and it was a derailment. It resulted in a fire and a release of oil there on the land. Luckily, we only ended up with one drop of crude oil in the Columbia River, if you can believe it. And then just the picture just below is another large response that our teams responded to. It was a 100-year-old wooden structure along the Willamette River, right in downtown Portland. And it just happens that the roofing material was made out of asbestos. And so as you can imagine, with a fire of that size, it basically burned the roof, turned it into ash, and blew all of the materials into the air and into downtown Portland. And the idea of asbestos-containing materials raining down into any big city is a nightmare. And so immediately we had to not only work with the local fire department to be able to put the fire out, but then start tracking down exactly where all of that hazardous material ended up landing. So that was a very time-intensive and a complicated emergency response, but very successful one. We were able to get the entire downtown area cleaned up. One of the other unique things about EPA is that we do respond as part of the federal kind of network of responding to disasters, both man-made and natural disasters under the Stafford Act. It's actually the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, which we just call for short the Stafford Act. It was enacted in 1988. In 1995, as you can see in the picture in the upper left there, that's the Alfred P. Murrow building. And that was actually unique. It was a very tragic situation, but President Clinton at that time actually incorporated EPA into the national response system to be able to engage and support counterterrorism activity, which up until that time we had not. It's not an area that the Environmental Protection Agency was involved with. But now we do, as part of our hazmat capabilities, have the ability to respond to weapons of mass destruction as well as other chemicals that may end up being used for terrorism or other kind of unfortunate situations. And then the most recent thing, natural disaster. When I first started in the emergency management program, it wasn't an area that we actually emphasized. Flooding was probably the most predominant natural disaster that we saw in the Pacific Northwest. But around 2016, 2017, we started to see wildfires crop up to the point where then in 2017, in Napa, California, there was a severe wildfire that really burned through much of that particular area. So we supported our San Francisco office and Region 9 to do that. And then in 2020, we had Oregon, the Oregon wildfires were affected a lot of places like Ashland, Oregon. Many of the towns surrounding that area ended up, unfortunately, being burned because of the wildfire impacts. And then most recently, just last year, we had the tragic events in Lahaina, Maui, with the wildfires there. And so Region 10, the way that we work is we are one of the backup regions to our San Francisco office. Many of my folks spent quite a lot of time on Maui, being able to help and support the recovery efforts related to that devastating wildfire. As many of you probably have been studying, especially in the world of emergency management, the incident command system is one of our premier or primary leadership management tools. It's important that all emergency managers clearly understand the system, how it functions, how to be able to stay in your lane, know when to be able to kind of manage up or manage sideways, and then work through the planning cycle. And that is a critical skill. to be able to master. And, for our responders, they always start in operations. So as an emergency responder, you go out and you work with our contractors, or they integrate with the fire department. They start in operations, and then once they graduate or gain enough experience, they get into involved with planning. And then those that are able to plan well and then plan operations, and then many of those end up as our seasoned veterans, serving as the incident commander for EPA Region 10. Another concept that's important, we can talk about this if folks have further questions, but it's really important when it comes to understanding what is an incident, and then how the incident can become an event, and how at times you have these concentric circles that you can see, and in the area of overlap, to be able to communicate and coordinate effectively. It's an area that we teach our emergency responders, as I said, through the incident command system, the difference of how to be able to size up an event, how to go about managing the incident, and then realizing that that incident is either gone really big, or because of the number of impacts, or maybe perhaps of the stakeholders that are involved, the incident then becomes an event, and it ends up having to both be managed well in order to successfully deal with that emergency event. And this is just the last slide. What I wanted to do is maybe bring it back to Lori and help facilitate any questions that folks have. But these are the managers. We have 4 manager positions in this particular branch. And again, myself, I have a director and a deputy that helps me manage our division. But, again, up in Alaska, it's road, river, or rail. That's how we do a lot of transportation of crude oil or refined products. You can just see a picture there where a tanker had flipped over, and one of our responders went out to go deal with that oil spill. And of course, in Alaska, we have the 800-mile Trans-Alaska Pipeline. That's, we have a lot of oil and gas activity in Prudhoe Bay, which is in the North Slope of Alaska. There's an 800-mile large pipeline that takes all of that crude oil that we consume down here, down to ships that get loaded, and then comes down to Anacortes, or the Cherry Point area just up north of Seattle, to be refined into product. Then they get shipped throughout our area. So these are the commodities trading of how refined products is one of the things that we have to keep an eye on. That's an important part of kind of understanding the planning effort, whether you're dealing with oil or hazmat or natural disasters. Being able to plan what to do and how to do it when that time comes becomes also a critical skill. So with that, Lori, maybe I'll kind of turn it over to you and those classes, and I'll stop sharing my screen. How's that?
Yeah, sounds good. Great. Thank you. Appreciate all of the background that you provided, not only about kind of the structure and how Region 10 is organized, but also those examples of some of those incidents that you have come across or that require the response and coordination through the EPA. So I think that's very helpful. I was really interested to see and learn from hearing you talk about the wildfires and how much support you've provided even outside of the Region 10 area to other areas that have gone through some pretty devastating wildfires. And of course, here in Idaho, as well as lots of those Northwest states in Region 10, wildfires are one of the most frequent things, in addition to flooding, that we face on a real regular basis. The Maui tragedy was such an extreme, fast-paced scenario and so much loss of life and property destruction. But what were the impacts and the ongoing impacts to the environment? Could you speak a little bit about what an area will go through for environmental recovery after those times?
Yeah, this is a very interesting, I guess, time where, because of our population, or population growth, as you can say, is, that we move into areas where, probably for a long time, fires took place, right? And, human beings, in order to be able to live in, whether it's an affordable area or places that we want to be able to live because of the beauty of the area and whatnot, we built houses or built towns in these areas and they've expanded. Well, lo and behold, when you combine the two, and I think really climate change is really affected, maybe the frequency of the droughts and or the growth of, plant materials that can actually easily burn at certain points in time. That's where, with active forestry management, everything starts to kind of coincide, right? Kind of stack up on top of one another. And we end up in situations where, due in drought situations, our rural areas become really, really tinder dry. And unfortunately, places like Maui, what I understand, historically, they've had fires. But when you expand the number of homes in a particular area, or if you're planning and zoning, you have one way in and one way out, and we don't plan where human beings could live effectively and safely. What we end up, unfortunately, is when a fire happens, it burns through a town or burns through an area. And where EPA gets involved is many of us, and we I guess unconsciously start to collect household hazardous substances, right? Simple things come from, cleaning your shower to paint products to, automotive products, propane tanks, a variety of different things that, we utilize each and every day. But when we have a fire or a flood, they become unstable at times. And so these are the things that EPA is called upon to do under the emergency support function under a disaster response, hazardous materials and oil spills. EPA is asked to go in to be able to clear an area that's been burned out. And you saw one of those pictures where you had a whole subdivision that is been burned through. In order for the recovery effort to be able to come back, EPA is then asked to go through those areas to be able to pull out all of those hazardous materials so that then, those families can come back and start rebuilding the homes that they may have lost.
Yeah, I guess we don't always necessarily think about how concerning even small volumes of household hazardous waste can be in those scenarios. And certainly, the cleanup effort looks, overwhelming when you have so much material that has been completely damaged and destroyed. Do you feel like EPA's role is to be there from a certain period of time and stay for a duration during recovery? Is there any role in seeing how the ecology around those areas start to recover, or does that transition into a different realm?
Yeah, we have different groups within EPA that may help in various stages of a disaster response. But in the emergency management program, and specifically in the emergency response program, we go into that crisis phase, right? When you have life safety, property, people affected, those are the times where we then send in our emergency responders to go in, set up the incident command system, have the superstructure to be able to manage in that kind of crisis phase, go in and clean up sites to be able to make sure that they are rendered safe. And then we get to a point where in some cases, if drinking water systems or wastewater systems are affected under the emergency support function 3, which is critical infrastructure, we may be asked to come in and be able to kind of rehabilitate these particular areas. There's actually different groups within EPA that will come in and rehabilitate a wastewater system or a drinking water system. And then you'll see programs or groups, teams kind of swap out during that crisis phase. But then ultimately EPA's job would be then to kind of phase out, right? Once the areas have been cleaned and then those infrastructures have been put back in place, then there's the recovery process, and there's actually, other EPA, either EPA groups or other federal agencies that would then take over to be able to then help families come back to be able to get back into more of a recovery mode.
Yeah, that's great. I want to take a minute and just kind of remind folks that if they have any questions, to please use the Q&A form. You can type out some questions. I'll check in on those periodically. I'm glad that you mentioned emergency support functions, because that is something that we in our classrooms definitely talk about. How do you organize so many different players on the field? How do you ensure that you've got the right people showing up at the table with the right resources, and that you're not stepping on each other, and you're not being redundant with multiple entities trying to do the same thing, but stuff isn't falling through the cracks. It's a lot to kind of coordinate. So I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts and perspectives coming from a regional perspective. You've probably seen a lot of different structures, a lot of different EOCs, a lot of different coordination structures, and certainly ICS runs pretty consistently across the emergency management field. But ESFs, the emergency support functions, in my experience, have been done to different levels in different organizational settings. Do you have any insights about, how consistent do you see ESFs being utilized, and do you find that it works well? Or are there still some operational hurdles involved when those are in play?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lori. From my experience, and at least for the federal government, right, is FEMA is in charge. When a disaster declaration is requested by the governor of a particular state and then granted by the president of the United States. When that happens, then FEMA becomes in charge. Essentially, using a sports analogy, at the quarterback or the pitcher of the baseball team, they call the shots of how to be able to get organized. And each emergency support function, there is a lead agency that is, been designated to be able to ensure that that level of organization that you talked about is in place, so that we can, coordinate all of the efforts. Essentially, you probably heard the term "stay in our lane," so that we're able to do the work we need to do and not to get to a point where it gets too confusing or too murky, or perhaps creating too much redundancy in what we do. Right? We want to be effective, especially in a disaster response, because there's already heightened tension. There is a lot of emotion. There's probably a lot of potential tragedy involved. And in those sensitive situations, time is of the essence. And so we want to be able to, go into a disaster response well organized, well rehearsed. And so I think those lead agencies then come into play, and each lead agency is then also rehearsed with their, sister or partner agencies to be able to make sure that we can rapidly and effectively go into a particular area and do the work that we've been asked to do by FEMA as the federal coordinating officer.
Yeah, so certainly you mentioned ESF3 being public works, or, looking at it from kind of where the engineering side kind of steps in, but also a lot of critical infrastructure aspects. And then, of course, ESF10, which is hazardous material. I imagine that there's quite a lot of coordination with fire personnel, different teams, as well as hazmat teams. Maybe there are some deployable hazmat teams. How does that coordination go among the EPA being at the federal level, but having direct on the scene assets and people with that, boots on the ground coordination? How does that coordination work?
Well, Lori, all incidents start locally, right? Every incident has some local official there, whether it's the sheriff or the police department or the fire chief, or any other organizational governmental representative that starts at the local level and then calls in help from the standpoint of whether it's mutual aid or assistance. And we rehearse a lot to be able to do that so that you don't end up with turf battles or, who are these folks versus these folks. We're all wanting to be able to do the right thing from a standpoint of integrating into supporting that incident or event, if that's what's created. So it takes a lot. So let me give you an example. In Idaho, we work with the local fire departments. Each town has either a professional fire department or a consortium fire department or volunteers. We work with the state, whether it's the Department of Environmental Quality or Department of Emergency Management, but oftentimes, and then we have the National Guard programs too, right? Where we have
right?
there's assets in
CST,
place. Yeah,
yeah,
yep, the CSTs, the civil support teams. We work with them, and so what we've been annually, actually every I think twice a year, like for in Idaho, we actually have trainings where EPA comes in to teach classes, whether it's specific to hazmat awareness or identification of what those chemicals are, utilizing the equipment that we have. And oftentimes we end up, making sure that we buy similar types of equipment. So they train on the same equipment that we have, right? So that then, a lot of things are interchangeable. And so that also that we can augment each other's responses from the standpoint. Let's say a local fire department has a situation going. They're using certain types of air monitoring equipment, but because of maybe the frequency, they have maybe 2 units that they have, but they have them in place. The CST comes in and augments it and put maybe 2 or 3 more units. Let's say that the incident becomes larger, or it's a fire, or it has chemicals involved. And so they'll call us in, and maybe we have, 10 more units. So now all of those units are being able to be integrated into a network so that we can actually, manage for example, air monitoring capability by 10 times. Right. And so that's where then local, state, federal government, as well as others, are all working together to be able to do one thing, make sure that, the community is safe and the environment and public health is not impacted.
Yeah, we did have a question roll in that kind of asked, but you were already kind of addressing that, which is, how does the regional EPA work with local communities to assess and prepare for potential incidents? Not so much waiting for the response, but talking about training together, kind of co-training and exercises and things like that are probably some of those best things. What about planning? I'm kind of curious too. We hear a lot about local emergency planning committees, the LEPCs, that if there are high volumes of chemicals in a particular jurisdiction, they are required by mandated to have a LEPC. Does EPA have any interaction with activities of a local emergency planning committee?
Absolutely. We actually, as part of the staff, we have 3 planners that are full-time. That's their primary job. We have a Homeland Security planner that works with FEMA as well as our other agencies to be able to do disaster response preparation. And we have 2 what we call response planners. They work within the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and that's their primary area. And then we have one based up in Anchorage that works with our Alaska organizations. And their primary job is to be able to help kind of think through, right? Again, using like the sports analogy, you're never going to go into the Super Bowl or any other major sports event when the championship is on the line. We're out rehearsal. You've thought through tactically, strategically, what is it that could happen? What is the worst case scenario? What are the issues that we can encounter? Whether it's equipment or people or technology, all of those things have to be thought through so that when the bell rings, we're always prepared. Because when the bell rings, it's not the time to be able to create new relationships. It's not the time to be able to test out new equipment unless we absolutely have to. So being able to go out and plan effectively is an absolute critical thing, so that then when the bell rings, we're able to then, and it's almost a surreal function, right? Go in and do the emergency response because we've already planned it through. Our folks already know what to do or who to call or who their partners are going to be. We've already pre-designated some of the equipment or where it's going to go. You know, you remind me, Lori, of I showed the picture of the Mosier
Right.
crude oil train derailment. Back in the early 2000s, when I first started as a manager, I knew based on the commodities movement, right? And we're watching Bakken crude oil, shale oil being extracted out of the Dakotas, and then trains coming down, bringing those commodities, those oil products, through the Columbia River Gorge and then back up to the refineries in the Pacific Northwest. We knew at one point in time, based on all of the other incidents that were happening, whether it's Lac Megantic in Canada or in other places, that when a crude oil derailed, it's going to likely catch on fire. It's going to probably be pretty catastrophic. And we studied the nature of the oil. So given the number of trains that were coming on the north and south side of the Columbia River, we started preparing. We prepared locally with the local fire departments and the volunteer fire departments. We created mutual aid agreements. We had oil spill and booming training. We made sure that we knew exactly where all the equipment was located along the river. We made sure that the local teams knew how to be able to deploy it. We worked with the Army Corps of Engineers that managed those dams on the Columbia River to be able to ensure that they could also then deploy boom. They could protect the dams from entrainment of oil, which would create even more of a problem. And then we kept building. We did it on the Washington side, we did it on the Oregon side, and we kept building that team and building the scenarios all the way up until here at the regional office. We were rehearsing with our regional administrator, and he at that time was then communicating with the administrator for EPA, and then subsequently to the White House as well. And lo and behold, it happened. I was out of the office. I got a call saying, Calvin, there's a crude oil train derailment. It's on fire. It's on CNN right now. I looked at my phone. I said, sure enough, it was there. I went, got back into the office. We deployed as we practiced, got a team down there. Everybody integrated through. And within a matter of hours, we had an incident command post set up. We had the incident command structure all set up. Folks knew exactly what they needed to do. We had boats going up and down the river, and by a little bit of luck, just a little bit, all of that oil that was released got captured into piping of a wastewater treatment system that just happened to be there. We killed the wastewater treatment system, but it contained the oil, and that's how it ended up where we only had one drop of oil. But it was really one of those situations that could have been a lot worse. But thank goodness of a lot of planning, we were able to really avert an environmental disaster.
Yeah, I remember that incident well. I was not out of the office that day. I was in the office working for the state Oregon Emergency Management, and yes, we had been a fine-tuned machine on that particular topic. It was on our radar. The governor was incredibly concerned about all of the crude oil trains that were traveling through Oregon, and it was just that disaster we knew was all that was going to happen, and that really forced us to make sure that we had reviewed the plans, that everybody knew what their responsibilities were, and there was really excellent coordination through that incident. It was really when you could step back from the intensity of it actually having taken place. I remember our after action review of that revealed that there were so many things that went well, through that. So yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective and how that played out for you being in the EPA. That was great. Let's switch gears a little bit. So we've got a pretty strong partnership with Idaho National Labs, our university does. And I wondered if you could maybe give us some insights about how the EPA might work with either Idaho National Labs or even other labs, whether it's Pacific Northwest National Labs or different labs throughout the region.
Yeah, the Environmental Protection Agency is a science-based organization, right? So, besides implementing programs, we do a lot of research, and in order to be able to always think about what's the next cutting edge issue or technique to how to be able to, whether it's cleaning up sites or disinfecting water or treating water or whatever it may be, how is it that we can do that? And so, actually, EPA Region 10 has its own lab. It's based in Manchester, Washington. They do a lot of processing of environmental samples. We're co-located with the Washington State Department of Ecology's environmental lab. So there's a lot of collaboration that happens there. But we also have, as part of our agency, the Office of Research and Development. And that's really the scientific, kind of the research arm of EPA, where we have all of these additional scientists that basically their job is to figure out what is the new technology when it comes to protecting the environment and public health. And so through that network, oftentimes a lot of the national labs do work together, depending on, kind of the research. It almost becomes really kind of the academic part where a lot of those connections are made. So whether it's, the Patel labs or Sandia or, Idaho National Lab, or the EPA National Laboratory System, those folks are always working together because there is always so much research that is needed, right, to be able to then understand what's happening in our environment based on the things that we inadvertently we've created. For example, radioactive materials. In some cases, it was we created radioactive materials because of the Cold War. We created radioactive materials because they were an energy source or a fuel source, right? For the military, whether it's the Navy, surface ships or submarines, all of those, essentially kind of research had to be done to be able to look for different ways to be able to do the work that we needed to do as a country, as a growing country. But they also inadvertently created, waste byproducts. And so we had to figure out what to do with it. And so, again, those are the primary things that our Office of Research and Development ends up working on. But yeah, there is a lot of collaboration between the labs themselves and as well as through the universities because they do so much research as well.
Yeah, as I'm curious, as a federal agency, does the EPA do you call for any specific research questions? Do you put calls out there for what you want researchers who are working in the field to be looking at? I kind of like to ask this question too because of our graduate students who have to conduct their own research. Sometimes if you can find a burning question that is out there or something that is, currently a topic with unmet needs, it'd be great to hear your thoughts about those.
Yeah, we actually have a liaison right here. I'm in the office. I'm kind of pointing down the hall here. We have a liaison with the Office of Research and Development right here in our office. And so, oftentimes they go through, a call for, hey, we're going to be doing some research. What kinds of issues or, things that could we help on? There are research projects that are always being kind of collaborating between the program and on the research side. But, let me give you an example. Kind of simple things, right? North Idaho has a Superfund site called the Bunker Hill Superfund site. I mean, it's huge. It encompasses most of North Idaho as a result of the silver and silver mining activities that took place over 100 years ago. And throughout that valley, the land and the soil are contaminated with high levels of lead. And so we have areas where on the riverbanks, they can't be cleaned up because it's just not cost effective. We just don't have enough money in the world to be able to clean up 100 years of contamination. But those areas, if you look at it, they look really pristine. You have, trees on the hillside, you have a nice river in between and, riverbanks. We don't realize that, those riverbanks are full of lead, high levels of lead. And so, we have folks that recreate in the area, they camp in the area. We try to make, we have signs out. We try to make sure that, folks understand, the hazards that they may be exposed to. For example, pulling a boat out of the river could expose themselves to lead. There's lead in the sediment of the river and whatnot. And the question I had for our liaison is there a way that we can combine the technology of, for example, how we do lead paint and how you can crack the chemicals in between, and you rub the wall, and if it turns pink, you have lead paint, so you need to remediate that lead paint. Is there a way that we can combine that technology with, for example, those disinfectant wipes, right? And so if we were to pull one out, and every recreational person could buy them at Home Depot, and they're wiping their boat or wiping their camper or wiping their hands after they encountered the area, and if it turned pink, they would know that they really need to wash their hands, right, before they or they ate or did anything, so they didn't end up inadvertently exposing themselves. So that was a question that I posed. They said, that's a great idea. I'm gonna take it back and see what we could do to.
All
but
right,
it's things like that. It could be really a simple.
Yeah.
A problem, but a simple solution. And so, that's something that they're checking on. So maybe someday, somebody will come out with some sort of, a wet wipe that can serve as an indicator if somebody's been exposed to lead.
Yeah, fascinating. And we'll know to attribute that back to you when we see that on the shelves at Home Depot. Okay, so I see we've got another question. I'm gonna bring this one forward. So earlier you discussed that the EPA is responsible for inland waters.
Mhm.
Can you discuss the effects of the 2023 Supreme Court's ruling in Sackett versus the EPA? How will that ruling impact Region 10?
That really impacts Region 10 from the standpoint there's a lot of water permitting and whatnot that takes place specific to emergency management and homeland security issues. It really doesn't affect us from the standpoint of the areas that we are protecting is for example, fuel tanks that are located right along a river system, and it just happens to be leaking, and you have this rainbow sheen that's going down the river. That's not a that decision doesn't have have any impact to how we go about making sure that the person that ended up inadvertently, maybe port maintenance or whatnot, that whatever caused that leak to be able to create that impact to that river system, that we can go make sure that they take care of it, they stop the leak, and then make sure that they go out and fix their problem and then clean up what they're responsible for. So the one area perhaps that does get a little murky is up in the North Slope, for example. There's tundra, right? There's frozen water that's underneath the soil, and a lot, most of the year in some parts of the North Slope is covered in snow or ice. And so those areas that may have like pockets of where you don't have a river attributing to it, or it becomes really difficult to figure out, are those waters that are navigable or not. And so oftentimes we have to get experts involved, maybe an attorney too, to kind of look at piecemeal out the language. But in those areas where it gets a bit complicated, we need that specialist to be able to make sure. Let's say in that case, if it's an oil rig that then ended up with a blowout, are those areas that are just within our jurisdiction? Can we then make sure that the person or the organization that affected or created that spill, can we order them effectively under the law to be able to make sure that they clean it up? And sometimes we do. It gets a bit complicated, so we have to get the specialists and attorneys in place to be able to say, is that something that we can enforce without creating too many problems?
Yeah, sometimes I'm sure it can be frustrating when you want to enforce and hold those people, the polluters, accountable. But if it's deemed that it's not exactly within your jurisdictional area, that probably makes it a pretty challenging thing to feel like the hands are tied.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about specific hazards. We have talked about crude oil, certainly. We talked about wildfires. We talked briefly a little bit about flooding. But let's talk about that really big catastrophic threat that we have in the Northwest area, and how, if we're talking about earthquakes in the Cascadia subduction zone, potentially even a tsunami that could be resultant of that. What is the EPA doing to think about your capabilities in that kind of a scenario where we don't know when it's going to occur, but we're pretty well assured that it will occur at some point. So what is the EPA doing on that front?
Well, preparing for disasters is one of those things that you become muscle memory, right? Whether it's a flood or a wildfire or an earthquake. These are things that there's a certain function that EPA has to be able to perform. Our number one thing is to be able to make sure our responders are safe and their families are safe. If that earthquake, let's say, were to affect the Seattle area, we have a lot of staff here, we want to be able to make sure that our staff and our families are protected and that they're in a safe place in order to be able to then go out and do the work we need them to do on behalf of all of us, right? As public servants. But let's say, if we are, if that kind of number one management objective is then covered and our responders are able to deploy, we then go out and do the work. And I think that's where the emergency support functions really play a key role, regardless of the complexity of what's happening, regardless of the magnitude. We walk through the process to be able to make sure that all of the various emergency support functions, the agencies are called in to be able to then come up, and basically say, implement your plan. And so each organization implements their plan and it gets dovetailed to be able to make sure that, life, safety, and health is number one, right? Life, safety, and health is number one. Once what life, safety, and health is then, and it may not be EPA going in at that time. It may be the local fire departments or mutual aid organizations that are coming in and protecting life and health. Once that is then secured and we can safely go into a particular environment, and then it may be pulling out hazardous materials or stopping oil spills or whatever it may be that needs to be done. That's when the EPA is called upon to go in and take care of that particular place. So I think, when it comes to, complex disasters or complex incidents or events, I think that level of kind of planning, as we talked about, is a critical part of it. I think it's compartmentalizing how we go about doing the work we do so that we can be well organized, rather than trying to fix everything. There's no one agency that has the authority to be able to do that. It really takes, everybody working together within the jurisdictions. And we talked about the legal aspects, being able to utilize the tools that they have, right, legally and the resources that they have to go out and do the work we need to do.
I think that's just such a great summary statement as we're getting ready to wrap up here. I think, the interdisciplinary requirement for us to all work together, so many different agencies, each one has their own specialty areas. I was fascinated during a project that I worked on for Oregon, which was the Cascadia Playbook. I looked at local plans, state level plans, regional plans, and FEMA even had a Cascadia plan. And that FEMA had an execution matrix at the back for all federal agencies that would have some sort of a task to do. And that was insightful because it showed what all of these different federal agencies were going to be called upon potentially to do in something as catastrophic as what we would envision that the Cascadia threat would do to that area. But really appreciate all of your insights and sharing the examples and the stories of incidents that you've been involved with. I think that was super helpful. I guess I'd like to just ask if you have any other additional thoughts, knowing that we've got, our student population that will be, either watching this later or at some point, what kind of words of wisdom do you have for the people who will be future, entering the workforce in the future as emergency management or homeland security practitioners?
Yeah, my advice to all of you students is it is absolutely fantastic time to get involved in emergency management, homeland security, environmental protection, coming into public service. Um, I've worked for EPAs for 30 years. This will be my 30th year. It's been absolutely a fantastic ride, serving the public, working with communities. It's not, it's not a job or a career that you're going to end up being rich, right? If that's your sole goal in life, then don't go into government, don't go into public service. But if you want a rewarding, rich career where you're really making a difference, helping each other, your communities, protecting people, I think going into public service has been a fantastic job for me. And we need more. We need people with diverse thoughts. We need people with diverse experiences, upbringings. That's the beauty of the United States, of who we are. And I think it's that, true value of diversity that we really need in all levels of government to be able to then effectively serve, our taxpayers that depend on us to be able to, deliver a variety of services, but especially emergency services, right? First responders, police, fire, healthcare, all of those have a governmental connection to it. And definitely now is the time to be able to do that. We have so many retirements. We have so many people retiring at EPA, and it's been hard to fill our ranks because there are so many retirements. So now is the time to be able to kind of really think about what do you want to do in your career? Who do you want to help? What type of work you want to be able to do? And I think, Lori, you talked about it. It's that multidisciplinary function, right? In particular, if you want to come for work for EPA, Homeland Security degree may not necessarily be just the thing that you need. You may need a physical science degree to be able to do certain types of work. So chemistry, biology, physics, forestry. There are a lot of physical sciences, hard sciences that you can also then get a degree in, and that would become, where one would become eligible to work for EPA. And so, kind of study the areas that you want to be able to involve with. But again, at every single level of government, there are so many retirements. There are a lot of opportunities to be able to build a rich career.
Yeah, well, excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Calvin. Thanks so much for joining us today and for, spending time with us to learn about your environment and your world. And so I'm going to close things out and just say on behalf of Idaho State University and the Homeland Security and Emergency Management degree program, we want to say thank you to everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thank you to you, Calvin. And if anybody needs any more information, go ahead and visit our website, which is www.isu.edu/ESD for Emergency Services Department. So with that, I'm going to close out the webinar. And thank you very much. I'll coordinate with you later.
It's been great. It's been great talking with everybody, and good luck, everybody, on your careers and what you're doing. I hope you do have a rich career in whatever you choose to do.
Okay. Thanks. Signing off now. Bye.
Bye-bye.